think about Apple and education, we think, certainly my thoughts start of when Apple had the Apple IIs, in all the classrooms, and then it became, iMacs in all the classrooms, and now, of course, we hear about iPads in all the classrooms. But for you, it's really much more than simply selling hardware.
Oh, yeah.
It's about a whole dramatic change of the education system, and maybe we can start there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the parallels are amazing. I think both industries are ripe for creative destruction. If you think about education today, the pedagogy is still based on a consumption model. Here's A, here's B, here's a linear process from A to B, memorize it, the test is on Friday. It's not really based on creativity, the student creating. And I think there's a number of challenges that we have that technology can come to the rescue. I think this is actually a 5th grade class, and as you can see there, the diversity of that class relative to the baseline orange line there of where those students are, both in terms of math and reading. And we ask our teachers. Steve used to ask me to do impossible things, and I would always respond, I believe in miracles, I just don't believe in scheduling them. Okay? I think we're asking our teachers here to schedule a miracle, because if you look at the time that it takes to diagnose this classroom, grade that assessment, determine what learning activities need to be sent to each of those individuals to overcome their gaps, and then retest and regrade, they've moved past the time frame where they need to be working on something else. So that's a huge challenge, and I think only analytics providing the teacher with the appropriate learning activities that need to be sent to each student can solve. But if you look at some of the other challenges here, this is a slide I put together for actually the university, but the incoming freshmen next year, this is their life. So you can see that they were 3 years old when Google was created. So they've never walked into a library and gone through the duodecimal system to look up things. They'll do an automatic search. They were 6 years old when the ecosystem, if you will, of music changed. 9 years old and 11 years old with Facebook and Twitter. So they have been in a collaborative publishing mode since they were 9 and 11 years old. 12 years old when the iPhone came out, 13 years old with the App Store. So they probably never walked into a retail store to buy an application. They've been delivered to them. And this, I think, is how they would like their educational content delivered. And of course, 15-year-old when the iPad came out. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can kind of see the scary nature here of these digital natives.
So let me ask you, what's the impact on education in terms of how do schools have to change today given the inputs, and what is the how does it change? I mean, we've all got a paradigm of school with the teacher in front of the classroom, telling us what knowledge we need to have. So given all of this, if you had to go 10 or 20 years in the future, what are you telling schools?
Okay, well, and let me just kind of wrap up. This is another test that was done by an MIT scientist on brainwaves. And as you can see here, you'll notice that the brainwave, there are brainwaves in watching TV, which is passive, and there are brainwaves in class, which tends to be passive or flat. And most teachers will look at this and say, well, they're sleeping in my class. But if you look at the brainwaves of sleeping there, they're very active. And so the challenge here is threesome, right? This is a generation of students who've grown up in a digital world, who look at technology not as a tool, but as an environment. They want to create, not just consume information. And yet the whole pedagogical system right now is really based that everybody's the same, everybody's going to go through the same hoops. So if I were to create a what I call new dimensions in learning, if I were to look at the pedagogy in a typical classroom, it would be a 3D graph. You would plot collaboration, the community of learning, collaboration versus content, the ability to access and curate the content, and then versus context. And that is, how does the community put that content in a relevant, challenging context. And if you plot most schools today, they're high on content, very low on community and collaboration, and almost non-existent in solving problems, relevant problems. So we really don't ask our students to solve problems. We ask them to memorize, and the answers to the odd ones are in the back of the book. Yeah. So the ecosystem, if you will, that needs to be built around learning needs to be built around allowing students to be creative. The example that I use, just to kind of give you a visual, is, when I took chemistry, periodic chart was on the wall, and we memorized the periodic chart. All right. I was in his classroom the other day, which was a one-to-one iPad classroom, and the students were in tables of 3, and sitting in front of them was a colored Easter egg. And in that Easter egg were colored beads. And the students were asked to determine what element that those beads represented. And so each group had a different element. And it turns out they were elements that make up water. And the overlying question for the students was, is your water safe to drink? All right? It wasn't memorize the periodic chart, but here are elements that you need to determine what those elements are, whether they're relevant, they're present in water, some are carcinogenic, some aren't. Then they test their water, and they learn that our water does have carcinogenic elements in it. And the question is what is the percentage? And who determines what percentage is viable, yeah, or safe or unsafe? And so it's a different pedagogy in teaching. And I think the same parallels that we talk about in the medical industry, changing people's attitude, exists also in the classroom, because it's not rocket science, it's just different. And so I think the biggest challenge we have is really with teachers, getting them to understand that, 1, this is the nature of the student, 2, that we're leaving a lot of students out because we have to teach to sort of the least common denominator, and 3, that technology is really going to be, particularly analytics, being able to determine what your gaps are and deliver the appropriate learning activities to you.
So you ran a school, and now you're selling tens of millions of iPads to schools. If you could create the school of the future that a child today that's born today will be in, what would that look like? So I understand the whole pedagogy is going to evolve, but what would that school look like?
Well, the students first and foremost would be much more proactive in their own learning. Mm-hmm. All right, we would be able to determine, 1, their dominant learning style, whether it's kinetic, whether it's visual, and 2, to be able to deliver material in that style. We'd be able to understand where their gaps are relative to a framework, whether it's the Common Core framework or the IB framework. The technology would be able to deliver digital resources to that student to overcome those difficulties. So in a sense, I believe we have the ability to create a learning environment that works just as well outside the classroom walls as inside the classroom walls today. And the impediment is the traditional institution, yeah, and the way of doing things.
So there are a lot of parallels to what Eric talked about in terms
yeah,
of breaking down the walls of the hospital and the doctor's office, and what you're saying to school and the classroom.
I spent 5 years as a CEO of a genomics company where we used technology to process the data in the human genome with the idea of finding the protein that could be tailored to your unique DNA. And so when a lot of people call the parallel in education personalized learning, I really call it targeted pedagogy, coming from the medical field. And, it's interesting. I think it was Einstein that said, every child is a genius, but if you ask a fish to climb a tree, he'll spend the rest of his life thinking he's stupid. And I think we ask all of our students, in a sense, to climb the same tree because we really don't have the data, that the baseline, if you will, of where that student is at any given time. And I think the other interesting thing for me was one of the companies that we work with, eSparks, which vets apps and then delivers apps to students to overcome gaps, actually has a kind of how I want to say it, a meter, so that the students can actually tell the teacher, I'm sick, I feel good, I didn't eat, I didn't sleep. because I think that's a component in the learning environment as well. So I'm hoping some of the devices that we were talking about earlier today can in fact be integrated into the classroom.
So teachers should Scanadu scout all the students on their way in.
I think, we all know, the times that we absorb information, learn better, are more creative, and I think some of the devices can give us some guidance in that.
So we have a lot of VCs in the room, and what's the advice to the people who are making investments in this new ed tech sector? So Q1 was record over 100, I think it was 104 investments in ed tech startups. Some record $500 million or so of financing. What's the advice to the VCs? Because as a community, we're kind of sitting on the sidelines. Relay, we've made 2 investments in EdTech. We're very, very interested in the space, but there's a hesitancy in the community because we don't really know if this has venture scale.
Yeah, I think that's really a challenge. I had 5 companies in my offices in the last 2 weeks who were looking at sort of that major round and being turned down because the VCs are looking for the billion-dollar hit. And there are obviously industries that provide that.
But this is a multi-billion-dollar industry ripe for destruction and disruption. There should be opportunity.
There is opportunity, but the challenge. I think what's going to happen, and it's very similar to what Eric was saying, is that the pressure is going to come from the parents. I have, 4 children that I spent $250,000 each to get through college. I now have 12 grandchildren, and the thought of paying for a college education 10 years down the road is a little daunting. And so I'm going to be looking for, and I have a 3-year-old, for instance, right now, who on his iPad already knows his numbers, his letters, and his phonics. And I'm a little bit scared to send him to kindergarten, because if he has to sit in that desk and wait for everybody else to catch up, I know what's going to happen. Yeah. So I think what I'm getting at is I think the entrepreneurs that are creating new ways of learning, new ways of measuring that learning, are going to challenge the traditional status quo. And as parents, we're going to be looking for those environments that meet our children's needs, that meet our needs. And so whether or not the schools want to recognize this, there are companies now and technologies that are challenging the traditional institutions.
So let's talk about MOOCs, for example. And what I'd love to get your opinion on is, how do you do this disruption? Because if it's possible, using Khan Academy and registering for courses in MOOCs, there's nothing stopping a 9-year-old from taking Stanford courses on Coursera.
Not at all. Not at all. In fact, if you look at some of the examples in iTunes U, there are 650,000 students taking the iOS development course at Stanford. A 11th grade teacher in Maine that teaches English literature has 65,000 students taking her course. I think that the thing that I think we need to be careful of is if the pedagogy doesn't change, if the pedagogy is still based on a consumption and not really allowing the individual to show their own creativity and to solve problems that haven't been solved before, then all the MOOCs or whatever technology isn't going to work. No one's going to pay us anymore to look something up. They're only going to pay us to solve problems. And I think how do we now bring that pedagogy back into the schools? These students, we call them digital natives, right? Have access now to experts all over the world. I'll give you one example of my son, who's now, it's almost 30, but when he was in 10th grade, he came to me and said, Dad, I need to do a science project. And I said, yeah, I realize that. Biology, you need to learn about, all about, what's the term? And so I said, what are you interested in? And he said, well, I read in a newspaper about deformed frogs, these frogs that are being born that have 2 legs. And he said, I'm really interested in that. I said, well, of course you realize that your biology teacher doesn't know anything about that. There's no book in the library about deformed frogs, and there's probably not too many scientific articles. What are you going to do? He said, well, I'm going to go to the internet. This is many, many years ago when the internet was new. And he came back, and I said, what did you learn? He said, well, 3 premises. He said, one is ozone layer depletion and ultraviolet light zapping the frog. The second one was pesticides in the agriculture land washing down into a pond, deforming the frog. And the third was a parasite had been found in the hind leg of the frog. And I said, well, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm going to email the professor in New York who wrote this small little article about finding the parasite to see where I can find a parasite, so I can take the DNA of the parasite and compare that with the known protein involved in limb generation. And I thought, boy, this kid's going to fail, because I don't know the answer to this, right? But fortunately, he had an instructor who said, this is science, right? And let's go for it. So he emailed the professor. The professor met him in Oregon in the summer months, and he, being a digital native, he had his MacBook and his digital camera and everything, and they found that these snails, these parasites hosted in snails. They packed up these snails in dry ice. He flew back to New York with the professor. At midnight, under an electron microscope, they were able to extract the parasites, amplify the DNA, and found out, in fact, that the DNA of the parasite was 98% homologous to the known protein. Wow. So he wrote up his science paper and said, this is equivalent to a terrorist going into the cockpit of an airplane, removing the pilot, and taking it in a new direction. And he won the science fair.
And this is 10th grade.
This was in 10th grade.
I wasn't doing that in 10th grade.
He got a call from Doug Brutlog at Stanford University and said, would you mind coming this summer and continuing your work? And he goes, no, I play basketball in the summer. So, but the point is that our kids are so much more capable than we give them. We ask them to memorize things. It's kind of ironic because Apple developed a framework called challenge-based learning, which basically allows kids to pick a big problem, whether it's your water drinkable or whatever, and solve that problem. And the irony of it is that the students that have the most difficult with challenge-based learning are honor students, because they're used to being able to just look at a problem, categorize the problem, apply the formula, and move on.
So is the baseline of everything that you've just sort of talked about the availability of technology on a one-to-one basis in the hands of the students?
I think it is. I mean, I think it's about collaboration. When I went to school, collaboration was called cheating, right? So it's the model that I'm going to skip this. I mean, this was one of Steve's early challenges, really, to me. And he said, look, all books, learning materials, assessments should be digital and interactive, tailored to each student, and providing feedback in real time. That's the ecosystem that I think we need to build. In the same way we built an ecosystem around music, which allowed us to purchase music, collect music, play music uniquely. We built an ecosystem around the phone in terms of the app store, modifying our phone to be whatever we want it to be. And certainly this morning's talk showed the power of the new operating system, the mobile operating systems. And so when I look at Apple over the years and look at the different industries that they've transformed, I think learning is obviously the next frontier for us. And we basically have, over the last 10 years, have seen this dramatic shift from going down to the lab and getting access to a computer for 1 hour to now where 24/7 you have access to the world. And I think that's what will do that. The other thing that just I can mention briefly, because I think these also are very viable for business, but these are the academic models that our strategy is really based on. The first is the Kohler and Misha model, which talks about, it's not about the device, but it's how the device fits into an overall ecosystem. How technology, content, curation, creation, access, economic model changes the pedagogy in the classroom. The second model, Dr. Ruben Putendera's model, which was an outgrowth of the Maine Learning Initiative, which was the first state to issue notebooks to every student, says that technology can be used as a substitution or technology can be used as a transformation vehicle. In other words, allowing you to do something in the classroom that you could not do without the technology. For me, that's analytics. I think it's physically impossible for a teacher to be able to know where each individual student is, what each individual student needs in terms of to overcome their gaps in the time frame that we give them. The third model, the cone of experience there, is Edgar Dale's. Talks basically what he says is student will remember 5% of what they hear in a lecture, but 90% if they get to do something. That's why the classroom's got to become much more creative. We can deliver, Dr. Mazur at Harvard University delivers his lectures online, and then he asks certain assessment questions, and then he pairs the students who have the wrong answers with the students who have the right answers, and invariably the students with the right answers are able to teach and convince the students with the wrong answers. And Lev Vygotsky's work here that talks about what he calls the zone of primal development, and he says this is what we can learn on our own, but that expands with a good teacher or a collaborative environment, and it just keeps expanding. So our goal really is to change that. And I'm going to skip all this and just do one last slide here, just to kind of give you knowledge is not a commodity that's delivered from teacher to student, but something that emerges from the student's own curiosity, fueled exploration. And how do we encourage that? Because our system doesn't do that. We talked about Seth's article. This is another interesting thing. It's called the flow. And if you plot the challenge level versus the skill level, you can see here if you have a very high skill and a low challenge, you're bored. And if you have a very low skill and a high challenge, you're frustrated. So the goal of the classroom needs to be right down the middle of that to sort of have a flow. And I think only with analytics can we determine what each student needs to be challenged with. And then if I plotted this just to give you an idea, if this is the pedagogy in the classroom, most classrooms focus is going to be on content, simply memorizing the content and regurgitating that content. Some teachers bring in more collaborative work. A lab tends to be a little bit more relevant in terms of the content and putting it into a context. The goal of the challenge-based learning framework was really to be high context. In other words, challenge the students to be creators of the information and not just consumers of the information.
Every time I talk to you, it feels like we've been talking for 60 seconds. We've run out of time.
No problem.
And I want to thank you very much.
No, it's my pleasure. Okay. My pleasure.